Welcome to the Political Philosophy Podcast. I'm Toby Buckle. The episode you're about to listen to is an interview with Amanda Podany on the ancient Near East. And this is a general sort of conversation introduction to this period of history. Pretty big period of history, and one that, if you've listened to some of my solo episodes, you know I've been interested in for some time, and it was really great to sit down with someone who really knows it, and as I say at the end of this interview, kind of just nerd out and ask a bunch of the stuff that I've sort of been trying to make sense of in my own head. I found today's guest, Amanda, because I read her book Weavers, Scribes and Kings, A New History of the Ancient Near East, and I always say how sort of good the books of my interviewees are, and I mean it, I don't give false compliments. This is my favourite history book, probably in the last few years. I don't want to, slight anybody else, but it is a truly fantastic read that manages to be engaging, fast-paced, comprehensive, and very, very readable, which, as we discuss in this interview, in fact, I do feel like, although I'm very interested in ancient Near Eastern history, a lot of the stuff isn't super readable. A lot of it, they don't take a lot of care to present the material very well, or just to make it engaging and to bring the reader in. There's some exceptions, obviously. This book is an exception. But this is a really, really great book, and if your interest is piqued in this period in history by this conversation, I would definitely recommend it. It's a big book, but you can it's very episodic, and you can read it in chunks. So, definite recommendation there. And it was kind of funny, the interview came about randomly. I just posted on Twitter, I just read this book, I think it's really great, you should read it too. And the publisher, it was with OUP, and obviously I know OUP a bit because I've published a book with them, and I've interviewed a bunch of their authors. So I said, really loved this book, and the publisher reached out to me and was like, would you like to interview the author? And I was like, heck yes, I would like to interview the author. And so this is that interview. Amanda Podany is Professor Emeritus of History at California State Polytechnic University, Pedoma, and the author of Brotherhood of Kings, How International Relations Shaped the Ancient Near East, and The Ancient Near East, A Very Short Introduction, as well as Weavers, Scribes and Kings, which I was just talking about. I won't go into more than that in the conversation itself. We sort of set up, what is the period of history we're talking about? How would you define it? How would you think about it? All those sorts of questions. But it did sort of occur to me that having referenced ancient Near Eastern history a number of times on this podcast, I've never just done an episode doing an introduction to it, and so I got my first choice guest to discuss it with me, and I'm really glad to bring you that conversation. This is The Ancient Near East with Amanda Podany. Okay, I am here today with Amanda Podany. Amanda, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for the invitation.
So just as a very brief introduction, what's your field of study? If someone asks you at a party, what do you do? What's your quick response to that?
My quick response is I start with, I'm an ancient historian, and then they say, well, what field of ancient history? And I will say I study the ancient Middle East. Mm-hmm. And specifically, my focus is the second millennium BCE, which is the period, especially from around 1750 to about 1300 BCE is the period that I focus on. In Syria, largely, although I've also done research in ancient Iraq. And this is the region that historians refer to as Mesopotamia, what is now Iraq and Syria. And my particular interests have been, well, two really. One is that I've done a lot of work on a little kingdom called Hana, which flourished during those years. It was in the region of Syria that is just west of the Iraqi border, northwest of the Iraqi border. And so that's been my academic focus. But I've also done a lot of I've had a lot of interest in relations between states, diplomacy, especially diplomatic marriage, trade. And I've written 5 books. One of them was on this issue. It's called Brotherhood of Kings, and it's about the diplomatic relationships, especially between 2300 and 1300 BCE. And I've also been very interested in using the approach called microhistory to examine very sort of tiny pieces of life in this big, 3,000 years of history that is encompassed by the ancient Middle East, really sort of zooming in on some individuals and their lives.
Okay, this is just a random question I have right now. Do you have any thoughts for how we refer, like what name we give to this, like essentially first half of human written history? Because like you said, ancient Middle East. In my head, I always say ancient Near East, which is kind of this like Victorian kind of old school way of saying it. We've also said Mesopotamia, which is maybe a bit better. I've heard some more sort of modern people say ancient Southwest Asia to try and get away from a Eurocentric view. Like, I don't really have a strong preference, but I find myself flitting between different terms. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. Ancient Near East is in the title of 3 of my books, so obviously I've used it. It's the traditional title. If you're looking for books in this field, you look up Ancient Near East because that's what it's been called for a very long time. There's been some pushback on that because Near East is very much sort of a Eurocentric perspective, just like Far East is not used anymore. So Middle East is what the region is called. So Ancient Middle East, I think, makes sense, even though it's still a bit Eurocentric. Calling it ancient Western Asia, people just don't know what that means yet. I think when I did my master's in archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology, they did call it ancient Western Asia at the time. But you say that to someone and they say, well, where's Western Asia? They know where South Asia is, they know where East Asia is, but where's West Asia? And so I think for the moment that term hasn't really caught on, although I suspect it will eventually. But Mesopotamia is just part of this region. So if we're looking at the whole Middle East, the whole ancient Middle East, Mesopotamia is just that region between the Tigris and the Euphrates. I would include Syria in Mesopotamia, at least the inland part of Syria. But then you say, well, what are the borders to this? And this is one of the other questions. Does it include Egypt?
Does it include Egypt?
Yes, but no. I mean, in some ways, there's an argument to be made for looking at Egypt as part of this big region. You could argue for including Arabia. You could argue for including Iran, Turkey. So when I'm writing about the region that I feel comfortable writing about, it really doesn't have a name. It's the region where they use the cuneiform writing system.
Well, the Egypt one, in my head, that was part of this sort of geopolitical ecosystem. I think the reason we think about it separately are 2 written systems that I think emerged, your hieroglyphs and cuneiform, and also just like departmental boundaries, like Egyptology is a thing, and Egyptologists study that, and then whatever we're calling your thing is a thing.
Yes,
and
exactly.
The people who study it. Like it's kind of like a modern separation.
It is, but it's also, it reflects an ancient reality, which is that once cuneiform started to spread, you have cuneiform being invented and first developed in southern Iraq, southern Mesopotamia. And it spread over time northwards. It spread eventually into what is now Turkey, ancient Anatolia. It spread into Syria, but it really didn't spread as the standard writing system into the Levant, for example. It didn't spread into Egypt, except just exceptionally when it was being used for diplomacy. It didn't spread into Arabia. It spread somewhat into Iran, but by the time of the Achaemenid Empire, it was not really being used all that much. So I think it culturally makes sense, because these were people who could communicate with one another using cuneiform, and they have certain cultural features in common that were not shared by Egypt. And so I think it's sort of Mesopotamia and its environs, but that makes it sound as though Anatolia is not, it's just peripheral, which it wasn't. Anatolia was a very important place on its own. But certainly the core studies in the field that I'm looking at revolve around Mesopotamia, yes.
So here's a question. Why, and you might disagree with the premise of the question, why are there less good public-facing history books or even like TV documentaries or anything, accepting that Egypt isn't part of this thing we're talking about? Because there's a fair amount on Egypt. There's a lot. Volumes and volumes on Rome and Greece. And I'm not saying there's none. I liked your book. Like, you know, I thought that was a good book that a non-expert can pick up and read. But there's not as many, right?
No, it's true. No, it's very true. I mean, if you go into a museum bookstore, if it's not just full of souvenirs, but, you know, you go into a museum bookstore, if there's a section on the ancient world, it will have Greece and Rome. It will have a lot about Egypt. You know, even the children's section will have stuff about Egypt because of the pyramids and the mummies and things. And you may find one or two books on ancient Mesopotamia. Very, very little. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. One is that Greece and Rome has been studied forever, and long before the decipherment of hieroglyphs and cuneiform, people were studying Greece and Rome, and there was this sense that that was the beginning of civilization. You know, Greece was the at least in the West, the Greek miracle and so forth. And so that's just continued. There's been a fascination with Greece and Rome ever since the time of the Greeks and Romans. But then when Egypt was, when with the decipherment of hieroglyphs and the discovery of the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, there was the Egyptomania in the 1920s, which I think hasn't ever really gone away. There's so much to see, right? There's these enormous great pyramids, absolutely phenomenal thing to visit, to see in pictures. There's the sort of sense of mystery. There's the amazing preservation of objects in the tombs because they're in the desert. Just there is a lot about Egypt that's very compelling visually, as well as in the sort of popularization of the mummy's curse and that sort of thing. When they started excavating in Mesopotamia, also in the mid-19th century, sort of contemporary with Egyptian research, what they found was amazing, but it's built out of mud brick. And so mud brick, as soon as you expose it, begins to disintegrate. So if one goes to visit sites in the Middle East today, there's really not much to see. There's a mound of dirt, and you can say, well, on this mound of dirt there used to be an amazing palace, and there used to be an incredible ziggurat here, and so forth. But the tourist industry is not going to suddenly have the same reaction that they have to the pyramids and the temples in Greece and Rome too. Obviously, beautiful stone temples and so forth that survive. I think another reason is that there isn't a sort of grand narrative of Mesopotamian history the way that you have Herodotus and Thucydides, and you have Tacitus, and you have in Greece and Rome there are stories that everyone learns in school. The Persian War, the Peloponnesian War, and then when you look at Egypt, a lot is based on the dynasties, the New Kingdom and so forth, the kings that everyone recognizes the names of. And Mesopotamian history has been sort of pieced together gradually. We've known Neo-Assyrian history pretty well for a long time, But the other kingdoms, the earlier kingdoms, they're still being discovered. There's still, oh, look, a new kingdom we didn't know about. Literally, you dig up a site and you find a name of a kingdom previously unknown. And so there is a sort of whole web of history. But the narrative line, which is so compelling for the sort of general reader, is hard to make in some ways. Or it's just overwhelming. I mean, if you do, and this was one of the issues I faced in writing the book, and my recent book, Weavers, Scribes, and Kings, is I wanted to do an overall survey of ancient Middle Eastern history, but I didn't want it to be, one king after another, the way that it's been done traditionally. There's this king in this dynasty, and then this king in this dynasty, because what we know about Mesopotamia is so much more than that. We may be lacking details about some of the kings, but we know so much about the people. And I think that's something that hasn't really gotten through to the general public. And another reason why perhaps it's not seen as interesting as it really is. I mean, one of my sort of goals in life is to have people realize this is a fascinating field, and there's 3,000 years of it, and there's tens of thousands of people that we haven't the names of, and they are pretty much unknown. It's really astonishing. But another reason, I think, it just continuing this, is that scholars tend to be very focused in every field. You tend to write about a very specific aspect of your research, and that's true in the ancient Middle East as well. And I think the desire to write a general book is a sort of mixed blessing if you do it, because on the one hand it's a huge undertaking, and you're going to be venturing into fields that are the expertise of other people. This is something that in writing in my book, obviously I'm not an expert at everything from 3,500 to 323 BCE. And so you're depending on other people's research and then reading what they've written and reading the documents they based it on. And it's a huge amount of work. And at the end of it, honestly, universities and the whole system of promotion and tenure and so forth don't actually recognize that as particularly valuable research. And so it's a labor of love to do it, rather than something that you do when you're trying to get promoted in your department. So I'm senior in my field. I'm semi-retired, and so I feel like, okay, I can do this. I don't need to worry about being promoted to the next level in the university. But and whereas many books about Greece, Rome, and Egypt are written by writers, professional writers who are doing this because they know there's an audience out there and they can sell books, and because they're interested, of course, as well. I don't think that exists really for the ancient Middle East. I don't think someone's going to necessarily go, oh, I want to write a bestseller, I'll write it on this, because the public interest isn't there. It's sort of a vicious cycle in a way.
Yeah, it's a chicken and an egg. I was also going to say, it's almost the opposite problem you have to like a lot of other cultures and periods of history don't get written about a lot because we don't have stuff that they wrote, So like if you look at Britain between the Roman period and Bede, nobody wrote anything, or if it did, it didn't survive. And if you want to learn about the Picts, we've got a couple of Irish annals in the Pictish king lists, which we kind of think were invented later anyway. You've got archaeology, and that's it. With the ancient Near East, you've got hundreds of thousands of these cuneiform tablets, and it's the other problem. You've got almost too much data, and I think for the non-specialist, the hurdle is just a lot higher to start getting into this period of history, because like you said, Greece and Rome come to us with overarching narratives of their own, and when you sort of study them, you realize, well, maybe a lot of that was propaganda, but still it's a starting point. With this, we kind of need books like yours, which I enjoyed a lot, and that because there's no obvious place to jump in here, and it is worth jumping in, and I've jumped in. I'm going to say it's worth jumping in, but it's a bit more of a steep step to get started, I think.
I think that's true, and also it's not really taught in schools particularly. I don't know about in the UK, but in the US, I looked at school curriculums at one point to see, where is Mesopotamia being taught? And in many states, it's in 6th grade, which is 11-year-olds, and then it never comes up again. And so you can imagine the average person, walking into Barnes and Noble or a bookstore is not going to say, "Oh yes, Mesopotamia, I remember that from school." Chances are they don't. It might be 1 week in 6th grade and then they're done. And so it's not something, and as you say, there's almost no documentaries, almost nothing on it that's out there.
No good, even like historical fiction. We've got loads of stuff for Rome or Egypt. Yes. Some of it's even good, but there's nothing for this.
Almost nothing, yes. And so it's just this void that people are unaware of. And your point about the cuneiform text is very good, because most people have no idea that this is true, that there are more documents from the time period from Mesopotamia than for any other ancient civilization. And it's because they wrote on an inorganic material, because they wrote on clay largely and on stone, that pretty much anything in the ground is going to survive. Whereas people writing on papyrus, like the Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians, papyrus doesn't survive in the ground, it's gone. And that's true also in ancient China, where you have paper being used, that for the very ancient period of ancient Chinese history, likewise, there's almost nothing. Whereas for Mesopotamia, we have their literally laundry lists. We have people's contracts, the letters they wrote. We have their sort of memos that they, just so much.
And to really triple down on this, because I think most people don't get this distinction either. Mm-hmm. These are, or not all, but these are autographs. These are the original documents, which is incredibly rare in other fields of studies. And I think textual criticism and textual history is one of these bits where people's eyes glaze over. But here's the bottom line. Your ancient Roman stuff, your Tacitus, your so on, as well as the Bible, right? We don't have the original documents. What we have is stuff that's been copied and copied over and copied over. How do we know there weren't changes? We pretty much know conclusively that there were, right? And sometimes we can catch them by comparing earlier and later manuscripts. The Jesus woman caught in adultery story, the cast not the first stone, that's almost certainly added later. You can catch that. But there could be other stuff. We don't know. For most of the periods we're familiar with, what you have is something where you basically have to trust a medieval monk copied it accurately. And should we trust that they did that? Absolutely not, right? Whereas for this field, not only do we have more, they're the original things, not copies, and that matters. And I don't think that's something that's appreciated about either. True.
I think there is some exceptions to that. There's the whole field of papyrology, of course, where they are working with ancient.
There's some. You've got your hieroglyphs. You have inscriptions. Yes. You have Augustus has some carvings on his tomb, which have to be pretty close to them. There's not nothing.
There's some, but you're right.
But the big works that we have are all copies of copies of copies.
Right, and I think what's really interesting is that means that we have what the Mesopotamians didn't intend to survive. These were not documents that they were necessarily preserving and thinking, oh, in the future they'll want to read this. I'm writing this with the future in mind. They were writing, a letter to their brother saying, can we get the harvest in this year? And that man writing that letter had no intention that letter was going to have any purpose except writing to his brother and saying, please send your draft animals because we need them for the harvest. That kind of stuff is absolutely amazing. And even with the letters, written, Hammurabi's a big name. Hammurabi wrote a lot of letters. We have his letters. They're not in his handwriting because he probably wasn't literate, but they're in the handwriting of his scribe, and they were written at the time, and they are, in the voice of Hammurabi as he dictated it. I find that, as you say, absolutely incredible. But we do have some of the same issue of the copies of copies, because the scribes of the time, when they went to scribal school, one of their assignments was often to copy important documents and important works of literature. And thank goodness they did, because in their case, it is sometimes copies of copies of copies that we have. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, for example, we don't have it in the handwriting of the man who put it together, a man called Sinleki Unini. But we do have copies that scribes copied in school, and enough of them that we can reconstruct what his work was. So there was already that tradition. But and it is thanks to scribal schools that we have most of the literature that survives from ancient Mesopotamia. But sometimes it was only maybe 100 years later, after the time of the writing, and sometimes they would copy things like, there's an example that I have in the book. Sargon of Akkad, who's a very famous figure, very early figure in Mesopotamian history. We have no original royal inscriptions from his own reign, saying, I, Sargon, did such and such. But the scribes copied those inscriptions from his often statues. And they even say at the bottom, copied from the statue of Sargon on the plinth, beneath the image of Lugal-Zaghazi or whatever. So the scribe will say on the tablet where he saw the original. And so that's only one level of remove. That scribe is copying perhaps exactly what he saw on a statue. And because we have those, we know about Sargon's history. If we didn't have the scribal copies, we wouldn't. So there's a bit of the copies of copies as well. The same thing that you were describing. But the fact that so many documents are, as you say, autographs, makes the field really fascinating.
I'm just thinking from the perspective of like biblical history, like what we wouldn't give to get the autograph of Mark.
Oh, right, absolutely, yes, yes, and even sort of a royal inscription written by David in that. Just imagine that.
The closest we've got is about 300 years later, someone on an inscription talks about the House of David.
Okay.
So that's a balance of evidence. I'd say David existed. Probably nothing like he's in the Bible, but that's pretty thin to go on, really. You've got an inscription that mentions House of David a few hundred years later. Like, it's just not a lot,
Well, it isn't a lot. And I think, obviously, I'm not a biblical scholar, but I think it must be very frustrating for biblical scholars to have exactly this dilemma where you've got this amazing book, the Bible being one of just the most incredible sources for so many aspects of history, but that it isn't, you don't have the versions that were handwritten even at the time. I think that must be a great source of frustration. I think that we have different frustrations, though, in looking at ancient Mesopotamia, because in some cases we are working on, for example, the kingdom that I work on, which is called Hana. We have a few hundred documents that have been found at various sites that pertain to this kingdom. And the kings are so far in the distance. We know very little about them. We have none of their royal inscriptions, except the ones that show up on their cylinder seals, which are very, very short. We don't know what they would have bragged about as their great victories. We don't know we don't have their peace treaties. What we have are a lot of documents written by people who lived in houses, who interacted with their neighbors, and that I love, because you can do social history based on it. But who were the kings? We don't know. That's we know their names. We know a little bit about what they did because they would record it in the names of the years. They would give a name to each year, and so we have a little glimpse of, okay, that was important to him that year. But it feels, I've used this analogy a lot, but there's a sort of sense with Mesopotamian history as though you have this enormous, someone described as a dark warehouse, right? This big dark warehouse, and it's got, somewhere out there is all of the history. And then you have a beam of light shining on one particular moment in one particular town, and these people interacting, and you can tell us so much about those people, and you can study them and do all kinds of interesting analysis. And then beyond them is this just unknown, because the beam of light is where the cuneiform records have been found, and the rest is still to be found, or perhaps never to be found. Which means that sometimes when you read a political history of Mesopotamia, there's a desire to make it sound as though we know just as much about all of these eras. And so they sound as though we do know the whole political history, but we don't. We really don't. There's big chunks of political history, as I'm sure will eventually show up, that we will be astounded by. Alliances between people we didn't know were allies. Even the kingdom Hana that I work on, I don't know if it was part of one of the big empires of the time, and if so, which one?
And
because
I think people don't appreciate the extent to which that is true of all history. Now, the spotlight hits a bit differently in ancient Mesopotamia. We've got like a lot of their store receipts and so on. You have a bit of that for the
yeah,
Romans and
yeah,
Greeks. But like, I'm thinking Roman history, you've got a lot of primary sources for that late Republic period. Like, we have like all of Cicero for some reason, right? And then it kind of cuts off, and you've got later historians writing a couple of hundred years later. But and there's a reason a lot of fiction about Rome is Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, because that's the bit we've got sources for. And
yeah.
Shakespeare wrote about it. But like all history, it's not like you've got a steady stream of information and it gets more and more as you approach the present day. It's really like choppy and uneven when you think about it in terms
Yes,
of primary sources.
no, that's very true. And really, until modern times, it is that is the case. I think once history was invented by Herodotus, once there was a thought that one would write, or arguably in the Bible too. I mean, it's obviously different type of history, but it is an attempt to write a narrative of a people. Once that tradition developed, then people were trying to write big narratives, and they give a framework on which the rest can be perhaps hung. And I think that's one thing that is missing for both Egypt and Mesopotamia, is that there really wasn't, at least at the time, anyone with a sort of mind of Herodotus thinking, I need to tell this story and I need to include all of the details and everybody who was involved, and I need to give some sort of pictures of who they were. And that's not the way they wrote. And so not having a grand narrative is, I think, actually a really good thing, because we're not wedded to it. I think one of the problems, of course, with cultures that have a grand narrative is it's hard to break free from it. That you've got whether it's Tacitus or Suetonius or Herodotus, Thucydides, whoever, Xenophon, you've got them in the back of your mind all the time of how does that fit with what they wrote. And in Mesopotamia, we don't have that, so we're kind of able to branch out in all kinds of different directions and find all kinds of different things. But that does mean that the sort of spotlight is not, there's not a string tying it to something the way that you would have got a grand narrative. You can say, well, at least this is somewhere in this part of the grand narrative, and sometimes you don't even know what century something is actually located in. You've got this wonderful little picture of a bunch of lives, and trying to sort of find any kind of synchronism so you can put them on a timeline, so you can say this is about when this was happening, which is wonderful detective work, and I've done quite a lot of it. But at the same time, a little bit frustrating in feeling, sometimes you feel very much at sea, that you've got these were real people, and you're reading things that were written in the handwriting of actual scribes who were there. And you can say so much about them, and you feel almost as though you're in the same room having a chat with them. And yet, where were they in time? How are they related to everything around them? That's an interesting challenge.
The word microhistory earlier. What does that mean?
Well, this is actually exactly why microhistory is so great for my field. Microhistory. I think the first major work of microhistory was Carlo Ginzburg, who wrote a book called The Cheese and the Worms in 1980.
Oh, I've heard of that. Okay.
Yeah, wonderful book. It's he decided to look at the life of I think 16th century Italian miller named Minocchio, who was recorded in Inquisition records. And he had a very strange, sort of very personal religious view. And so what Carlo Ginzburg did was to sort of reconstruct his world and his worldview. And so you have a whole book, best-selling book, about this completely unknown miller named Minocchio. And many microhistories have been written since then. Obviously, it's been 40-some years since that book came out. But largely, I think in European, American, and Chinese history, they've been written. I've seen a lot of work in microhistory in those fields. Wonderful books. And in each case, taking a set of documents that pertain to someone who is not otherwise well known necessarily, and who, by looking at their records, their life, you get a window into a part of their era that you wouldn't otherwise get. So it's a very much a bottom-up view of history. So whereas obviously political history is largely top-down, this is looking for what was it like to be a miller in the 16th century. And cuneiform records are perfect for this. Because, so for example, in the kingdom that I was talking about, Hana, which I've done a lot of work on, there's a city called, its ancient name was Terka. It's been excavated. They found dozens of tablets there. And these tablets pertain to a community of about 5 families who interacted with one another. They bought and sold fields and houses. They hired laborers. We can really get a sense of the lives of the people in this little community. And in the book, in Weaver, Scribes and Kings, I used one of them, a barber whose name is Gimel Ninkarak, as one of my microhistories in the book. And so the book is sort of a collection of these microhistories over time, tied together as a big survey, but in each case trying to sort of understand that era through the eyes of a particular individual. And using the techniques that microhistorians have developed, looking at the specific archive, looking also at related documents from other towns nearby. So for example, I know Gimel Ninkarak was a barber, but what did it mean to be a barber? His documents actually don't tell us. We have his little archive, but it doesn't say what his profession was like. So we can look at other documents from other sites from the same time period. What did barbers do? Turns out they weren't just cutting hair. The chief barber, which is what Gimel Ninkarak was, he was often the advisor to the king, one of his main advisors. He was someone who would be sent off in some cases to supervise soldiers. So unexpected things that were part of the job description of this man. We also know he owned quite a lot of fields, that he hired people, and we know the terms under which this, for example, a man named Idin Sin, who he hired to do some farming on his fields, who got 10 days of vacation, he got a certain amount of pay. All this, as I say, micro detail, hence the term microhistory, that really makes you feel you could sort of know these people, while at the same time they tell us something about their era that gives us a bigger picture. And so what a microhistory does is often focuses on a very specific question about a particular person or a very specific group of documents. It's a bit like a biography, but a biography goes often from birth to death, and a microhistory usually doesn't, because we can't. I mean, I don't know when Gimel Ninkarak was born or anything about his childhood. I couldn't tell you anything about that. The only period of his life I can tell you anything about is the period for which the documents survive. But yeah, we can do a lot with that. And so I think that microhistory is particularly, as I said, suited to cuneiform study. And I've been promoting that idea. I'm not the first. I mean, there certainly are other microhistories that have been done in cuneiform studies, but they haven't had the kind of popular audience that, for example, The Cheese and the Worms did, Ginsberg's book, or The Return of Martin Guerre is another one by Natalie Zeman Davis, where they start out as a book that is very focused on a particular era, but written in such a way that anyone can pick it up and go, wow, this is cool. This is really interesting. And I think that's when you asked your first question about, why aren't there more books and documentaries and so forth on this field? And as you said, there is this sort of, how do I grasp all of this? How do I understand all these names? How do I understand which king came after which king and which kingdom was before? You don't need to know all of that if you're reading a microhistory. You're reading about actual people. And I think that makes it both a wonderful way to explore this era, but also a wonderful way to make it accessible to a wider public.
I agree. I loved reading some of the little just stories of people and snippets on their lives. I liked the Assyrian trading families you did before Assyria was like a big deal. It was like a merchant network or something, right? And it always sort of takes me by surprise, and then I sort of think maybe it shouldn't, how like advanced trade has been like a thing, like forever.
Oh yeah.
You can both on the sort of far left and far right present international trade of some like harbinger of dystopian modernity and our world today with globalizing. You go back to the Iron Age Celts, and they were found with grave goods from Africa. You know, like, and
Oh,
then
it's even long before urban culture. Lapis lazuli, which is found way, in eastern Afghanistan, was already being found in Mesopotamia, thousands of miles away from its origin, in 6000 BCE, when they were still living in villages. I mean, international trade is a very, very, very old phenomenon.
And then by the time you get to your period, you have like the written records, at least for some of it, to be like, this is, you can piece together how it worked and like what the supply chain was.
Yeah. Yes, those Assyrian records are wonderful. And you're right, there's a very different Assyria at this point. This is around 1900 BC, so it's about 1,000 years before even the beginning of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And it was just a small kingdom. In fact, I say kingdom, it's one of the states that had the weakest kings in this period, where the real power in the kingdom was held by a council of elders. And it was a merchant community. Everyone of importance in the community was trading, and they were trading over how many hundreds of miles away, trading all the way with the city of Kanesh on the Anatolian plateau. That was their main trading partner, and these trading caravans would go back and forth. And as you say, they kept a lot of records, and the records were found in the houses of the merchants, not in Ashur, not in the capital of Assyria, but in Kanesh, in what is now Turkey. And there are tens of thousands of them. And they are so interesting because they record all kinds of details of how the trade was conducted. And it was very sophisticated. And these families of traders would bring textiles, which was the main export of the Mesopotamians, textiles and tin from Ashur, the city, their capital city, to Kanesh, where they would be traded for silver and gold, which would go back in the other direction. And there were debates about loans and about smuggling, and there was women back home saying, we haven't seen you for years, you need to come home. And there were families where the patriarch of the family was still in Ashur, and he was writing these letters to his sons who were off trading in Anatolia. It's a really, really wonderful field. And that actually, there are some books that have been written that are more accessible for general readers, which I would encourage people to look at if they're interested in that topic. But yes, that's one of the fields which is so well known and so not about kings. The kings are so peripheral to that story. It's really it's a fascinating one.
Okay, but moving to the kings then,
yes.
Is there okay, so on the one hand, it seems like we have sort of one institution that does political governance across the whole period with not much variation. On the other, you did just say one of the much weaker kingships. So just talk to us about that. Is government even really the right word? What did political authority look like? Is there anything common we can say across the period? Or I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, the kings were, yes, there were kings everywhere. That's certainly true. But what constituted kingship was different in different periods. The earliest kings were about 2900 BCE, so they had cities before they had kings. The very earliest writing from 3200 BCE, maybe even 3300, sort of debated. But the earliest texts don't name kings, so they don't seem to have had kings at that time. But quite early on, 2900, as I say, they did develop the idea of kingship. And once they had it, a whole sort of theological justification for it developed, or perhaps we don't know when it developed. It might have developed even sooner than that. But the what they believed was that the gods wanted them to have kings, that the gods had created kingship. And there's a text called the Sumerian King List, which describes, it says, when kingship descended from heaven. Mm-hmm. And so it literally was this idea that the gods sort of dreamed up kingship, gave it to human beings. This is how you're going to be ruled. And so that made it a very stable sort of aspect of Mesopotamian culture, that kings were going to be part of the governance of pretty much any state. But to what extent they ruled alone, to what extent they had a lot of help from others, or in some cases the ruling was really being done by others, really varied. So the most sort of obvious example of really powerful kings might be in the Neo-Assyrian period, where you have these kings who were presenting themselves as almost as though they had nobody helping them at all. You know, the royal inscriptions describe that there's almost no army. The king conquered everything. He was 100% responsible for everything. Of course, even there it's not true, but that was the way of presenting it. And at the other extreme, again, the same kingdom, Assyria, but 1,000 years earlier, where you have kings who really didn't seem to be very powerful at all. They were the decisions that one would normally think of kings making were being made by this council in Assyria, and they had a position called a limum, who was an official who was in place for 1 year, apparently chosen by lot from the population, who was responsible for things like tax collecting, and his name was the name of the year. So when you were made limum, that became the name of the year in which you were limum, and that was throughout Assyrian history was how they identified the years. So in most Mesopotamian kingdoms, it was either year 1 of King so-and-so, year 2 of King so-and-so, year 3, or the year in which the king conquered so-and-so, or the year in which King so-and-so built such and such a wall.
It must have got so confusing, even at the time.
Totally confusing, right. But in Assyria, it was the year so-and-so was limum, the year so-and-so, the next person was limum. And that must have been even more confusing, because it's like a phone book, it's an old-fashioned phone book. It's just a list of names. They're not even in alphabetical order. But because it was confusing, the scribes had to keep lists. And so you have limum lists from Assyria that are found with all of the limums in order, so that the scribes themselves could keep track of when things happened. But that's tremendously helpful for chronology, for us understanding, when something took place, because we can match that up somewhat with actual dates. And they did the same thing with year names. They would keep lists of year names so that they could keep track of how many years before, the year the king conquered so-and-so, how many years before that was the year the king built a dam, at such and such a place. So the scribes got equally confused.
So we've got kings as pretty much a uniform, albeit with considerable difference.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any sense of, asking why did something not happen is always a bit of a weird one in history. Do you have any sense of why, as far as we know, no one ever experimented with sort of other forms of government during this period?
I don't know. I think it's probably because of the religion. There's such even the term religion is a little bit misleading, because we think of religion as something you can choose and you can opt in and out of. In Mesopotamia, there was no word for religion. And it's true, I think, in Egypt too. It was so intertwined with every other aspect of life that it was not, it was inextricable. And so part of what they believed about the gods was that the gods had kings, that there was a king of the gods, and therefore the human realm sort of replicating the divine realm, you had a king over the people, just as the gods had a king over the gods, and that king was appointed by the gods, and that there was proof of this because they would read omens ahead of the choice of a crown prince, and the god's choice was indicated through various means that the gods could speak to humans, whether it was the spotting of a comet, or it could be that more common was they would do what was called extispicy, where they would, what is called extispicy, they would sacrifice a goat, for example, or a sheep, and they would look at the internal organs, especially the liver, and they would pose a question to the gods, and they would look at the liver for a yes or no answer. So it might be, is Prince so-and-so the right man to choose as king? And they would ask this of the liver, and the liver would say either yes or no. So because the gods were involved, I think that made it very unlikely that they would have sort of said, let's be done with this. This isn't working for us. It was part of their really deeply held belief system. And again, it's hard for us, I think, as moderns to imagine the mindset of everything is explained by the gods. It's not something where you can go, I think I'm an atheist. We don't have any sign of that in this culture. Everything around them was explained through and from birth you would be told this. The sun is rising because that's the sun god. The storm is coming because that's the storm god. The idea that you would go, I don't believe in them. They're right there in front of your eyes. It's not something that they, I think, could even conceive of choosing not to believe in. And I think kingship was in a way in the same category, that kingship was something that was a given once it had developed, and sort of unassailable in an interesting way. And I think, too, one of the reasons that it perhaps behind it is this is a patriarchal society. There's in the family, the father was, the principal person. And there's a lot of sort of extending the family model into other realms, so that your boss at work was your father. A greater king was the father of a lesser king. The god was the father of the humans. So I think this image of father is so dominant that, again, it was a single male figure being in charge just made a lot of sense to them.
To what extent, I mean, king is obviously male. To what was there, or to what extent do we see powerful or important or influential women? Do we have queens by themselves, or queens exercising power with husbands, prophetesses?
Yes.
Or religious women, let's just say.
Yes, and I'm really glad you asked that, because yes, absolutely there were. It's a patriarchal society, but they didn't dismiss women at all, especially in the first, in the third and second millennium, the sort of first two millennia of urban culture and kingship. In many of the very earliest kingdoms, the king and queen really ruled together, and we have evidence in some of them where the queen's archive survives. For example, at the state of Lagash, we have the queen's archive. We don't have her husband's archive in one particular instance. And so we know that she had her own diplomatic relationships. She had an important ritual role. She was she was in charge of a whole estate, a vast estate of hundreds of acres of land and herds of sheep and hundreds of workers. And she was in not sort of alongside her husband. That was her realm. He had his estates as well. But the one realm that it does seem as though we don't see much role for the women, for the queens, was the military. And it's possible that one of the reasons for the development of kingship, this is one theory, is that someone was leading the military, and that person became, over time, a king who was not necessarily also a priest. And then there had been probably priest kings in the earlier period. That's what they're often referred to. But this person who, although he's appointed by the gods, he certainly does some ritual things. He's not a priest, not a high priest, and he becomes the king. But yes, early on, those queens had a lot of authority and a lot of power. Gradually that declined over time, that by the second millennium the queens weren't quite as powerful as they were in the third millennium, first millennium less so again. So it's sort of, one sees a steady decline in the power of the queens. As for a queen ruling alone, the only one I know of that is a vague possibility is a queen whose name was Puabi. She was a queen of Ur very early on, probably 2500 BC, something like that. And she had a tomb that was found, and her cylinder seal calls her Puabi queen without saying wife of king, and doesn't give her husband's name. And that's been used to propose that she might perhaps have ruled as a queen independently of her husband. I don't know. It's very, very elaborate tomb with all kinds of gifts and so forth. But that was also true of the queens who ruled with their kings, with their husbands, because although their tombs haven't been found, there are records of the funerals of some of these women, which were incredibly elaborate, and the amount of wealth that was given to them would have been absolutely gobsmacking. So I'm not sure about Puabi, but aside from her, there were women who were regents for their sons, who seem to have taken on quite an important role, but not necessarily actually ruling independently.
So the king pretty much, and with like some asterisks.
Right.
That
right.
has to be a guy. But in some periods, particularly earlier, you can have a queen and a king ruling together, where the queen is also quite powerful.
Absolutely.
Also in religious roles as well, right?
Yes.
In a lot of systems, women can be important and powerful and influential on the... Religion's a bit anachronistic, but on that side of things.
Yes. The high priestesses were important in all eras. So a god would have a high priestess, and she was not just a religious functionary. She would also have been an administrator of the temple estates. The temples had, just as the palace would have an estate that included land and orchards and herds of animals and workmen and workers of all kinds. So that would be true of a priestess as well. So and a temple, and she would have been the ultimate authority in that world. And those women didn't marry. They were sort of seen as the spouse of the god that they served, and that was the sort of perception of it. And they were so important that I mentioned the year names. When kings were naming their years in the second millennium BCE, very often a king would name a year after the appointment of a particular priestess. I appointed so-and-so to be the high priestess of the god, the moon god or the sun god or whatever. And that was the most important thing of that year, was the appointment of that priestess. And very rarely did they name years after the appointment of priests, interestingly. It's almost very largely priestesses that were the important figures who'd been appointed. So yeah, they were significant. And there was a whole group of women who've been classed as priestesses, but I think it's a bit of a misnomer. They were called naditums, and they were women who were dedicated to a god when they were children. So they were girls who were sort of taken out of their, given by their fathers to the service of this god. But they were businesswomen, and they any translation of naditum is misleading. If you call them nuns, it's completely the wrong image. Priestess, I think, is wrong. They were women who were functionaries in a temple where they did spend some of their time praying to the god for the wealth and health of their families. But a lot of their time was spent making loans, managing their fields, buying property, sponsoring business, trading expeditions. And they too were unmarried. Well, no, that's not entirely true. It depends on which city. Generally, they were unmarried. Even if they were married, they weren't allowed to have babies of their own, so they would adopt children. So it would be a situation, presumably, where they were celibate, although there's actually no evidence of a vow of celibacy. But mostly they didn't have children, and mostly they didn't have husbands. And they were just these powerhouses in this period in terms of their business acumen. And they would often adopt another naditum, who was often their niece, who would take care of them in old age. But they were a fascinating phenomenon.
Well, while we're on religion, one thing I always sort of struggle to maybe get my head around in this period, and I think it's sort of perhaps an anachronism because our understanding of God is just so different, right? That if you kind of go in with this like invisible, uniform, benevolent force idea, like you're going to be misled. But like, okay, so talk me through or correct me. You've got worship of gods that are very physically embodied in statues, also of long dead kings who seem to be in a similar way. But it's not, when if I go into a church and there's a painting of Jesus, that is a painting of Jesus, right? It's not directly representing the deity. And they don't talk about statues of, these are the gods.
Yes.
And I've always kind of found it a little bit hard. Like, some people have given me the analogy once, think about like how someone might go to the grave of a loved one and talk to that loved one as if they're there, as a way of maybe getting into their heads. And that still doesn't seem to quite get me there. And there's just such an embodiedness to how they talk about them. This god lives here. They like living here. They get fed here. Oh, and now they've moved there.
Yes.
That, like, I don't know, help me out here. I've always sort of, I mean, I think as soon as you're saying I'm struggling to get inside their heads, that's a good sign you're understanding the complexity of ancient history. So when you think you've got inside your heads, that you're in trouble. But the whole physical embodiedness of the gods, kind of, it's what I always feel like I'm on the verge of kind of getting it and never do. I don't know. Help me out here.
Yeah, it is hard, because they literally do seem to have felt that the god was physically in his or her statue, that statue was something which, if it was taken hostage, and they did this, there were god nappings, where if a city was conquered, the city god would be taken hostage to the other place, but they would treat him just as well there. Everybody believed in everybody else's gods, and that god would be put into a nice temple and given food and drink, and made sure that he was happy in where he was living, and then they would negotiate for his return for a lot of wealth, to get to get the god back. And that meant that physically was the god. He was right there. And when you look at rituals, there are ritual accounts of the gods being brought out of the temple, paraded through the city. There's a very famous example of this in ancient Babylon, the Akitu festival, which was the New Year's festival. And they would take the god along the processional way. They would take him out to a particular temple that was built outside the city. And other gods from the other cities would come and meet there. And they would have the gods in sort of almost a G7 meeting. They're literally deciding the fates of the world in the forms of their statues in a building, and then they would go back to their own places. So it's not just that they, very much as you were saying, it's not just, this is an image of God, this is what he looks like. This was the God, and it was something that was so venerated. But that also meant that for the most part, through most of the year, the god was not accessible to the average person. You didn't walk into it wasn't a congregational religion. You didn't sort of come together in the temple and worship together. The temple was the place where the god lived. It was his house or her house. And they were given food and drink, and they were given clothing, and they were prayed to, and they were sung to and praised and so forth by the priests, but in a place that was very holy, very separate from the population. So it was a big deal when the god came out of the temple and paraded through the streets. That was the chance for people to actually get a chance to see him or her. And yet at the same time, and this is what I think really is confusing for us, for these cosmic gods, they were also in the sky. So the sun god is physically in his statue, but at the same time, he's also flying across the sky as the sun. And the same thing with the moon god, the same thing with any of the gods of cosmic forces. And they just didn't need to rationalize the way that we would, where we'd go, how can he be in both places? It just didn't occur to them. It wasn't a question. It just was. It was just what they'd always learned. And in the same way, they didn't have dogma in the way that a lot of modern religions do. You believe these things, and you're this. This is what makes you a Methodist. This is what makes you a Baptist. This is what makes you a Catholic. This is what makes you an Orthodox, a Russian Orthodox or something. None of that applied. There were the gods, there were humans, there were some stories about them, but you didn't have to sort of swear that you believed those stories. There was no definition of heresy, because there was no definition of what constituted the religion. Everyone's gods were real. Mm-hmm. They never came across a god they didn't believe in. And some of them were more useful than others in various places. But this idea that they could be physically in a place because they were physically in a statue was important to them. And there were, in some cases, multiple statues of the same god, because they would be in two different places. So, for example, the moon god had a temple in Haran, and there was definitely a statue to the moon god in Haran, but he also had a temple in Ur, and there's another statue to the moon god in Ur. That was okay. They were okay with that. That wasn't a conflict.
I found all this so interesting. I mean, One of the things that was the biggest this is slightly off topic, but it relates, was the biggest adjustment to me in historical readings of the Bible is I'm not religious at all, but I'd always just assumed monotheism going in. And actually, after a bit, it's like the whole text just unlocks in a sense when you realize, actually, no, you shall have no other gods before me isn't there are no other gods. It's you're my people in my land, and I demand exclusive worship. But of course, there's other gods, and that's why the not worshipping them is described as jealousy. It's not, you're not jealous of something that's not there. If there's only Adam and Eve in the world, Adam can't cheat on Eve, right? And the other gods have powers. The king of Moab commits a child sacrifice, and it works. The pharaoh's magicians do magic, and it works, just not as good as Yahweh's. And there's bits in the latter prophets and the end of the New Testament that sort of speak to what we're thinking about with monotheism. But no, to them, in those times, peoples had different gods, or a god of the person, and no one's doubting that the other people's gods aren't real. It's not like a Jew or a Muslim might say Jesus was not God. He might have been a man, he wasn't God. No, everyone's real. But in a particular area, you might want to worship a particular god, or if you have a particular association or whatever, there might be an obligation there. But it's not about the truth status.
No, exactly. I think polytheism is often difficult for people to. In fact, I had a student come up to me after class one time, and he said, "How could these people have been so dumb?" And I thought, no, you're not getting it. It's not.
Well, let's be clear. It's not as if there's any scientific evidence for monotheism either.
I think that wasn't his point. His point was, as you said, you come into it because we've tended to grow up in a monotheistic world. There's a sort of sense that is an obvious way for human beings to view the divine. And I think the point I'm always trying to make with my students is polytheism was absolutely real to the people who worship these gods. It was not a sort of we'll make do with this until we have monotheism. It was a world, a way of comprehending the world that made sense to them. That if something bad happened to you, it was because one of the bad gods was, some sort of demon. Things like, often this is around issues of childbirth and so forth. If a woman dies in childbirth, how do you explain that? Well, there's demons that were at fault, and you could wear an amulet to prevent that demon coming near, or to try to prevent it. There were also times when people were punished by the gods for doing bad things, just as you would expect. And there were times when people were punished by the gods for no reason at all, because the gods were just having a hissy fit. But all of it in their minds made perfect sense. And I think this whole sort of acceptance of everyone else's gods wasn't that they were being tolerant. It was just that made sense. If you go to Egypt, and there was a lot of, as we talked about, there's a lot of long distance travel taking place. They knew people worshipped other gods. But if you go to Egypt and the main sun god the main god is the sun god, well, obviously it's the same sun in the sky. It's not like they have a different sun god. They give it a different name, but that didn't matter. It was the same god. And sometimes you even find in their diplomatic correspondence that they will refer sort of very generously to the sun god by the Egyptian name, even if it's a Babylonian writing, just so the Egyptian knows that he recognizes that it's the same god. It's like the same moon god, the same storm god. They had different names in different places. But you go to a place, for example, the Middle Euphrates, the region that I research a lot, they had a grain god named Dagon. And Dagon was a very useful god to have that was imported into other regions because, you need a god of grain because that helps your crops do well. And so you do find this importing of gods. And it was still happening in Greek and Roman times, of course. You have the cult of Mithra or the cult of Isis all across the Roman Empire. That's the same thing. You find a god in another region that has these characteristics that are useful to you, and you find would be perhaps beneficial. And so that god gets a center of worship somewhere other than their original place. And I think they weren't sort of, it wasn't that they were being tolerant. It was just that's how they viewed the world. There were a lot of gods.
It's just how the world works. This is the god of this area and this thing and so on. And it's like, we're recognizing, we're not tolerating.
Right, exactly.
Would be
Yeah.
the attitude, right?
Yeah.
One of the things,
some gods were if you were in the Neo-Assyrian period, you felt that the god Ashur was the supreme god and was most powerful and therefore had the right to take over the rest of the world. But he wasn't the only god. He was in their minds the king of the gods at that time. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I try to do when we get something that's really counterintuitive is think, well, do they have it right? Like, because, okay, we think God, sort of universal, invisible, benevolent force, right? Okay, but that's our official theology. But we still act very much as if he's embedded in certain objects. We have objects of veneration. People have their crucifixes that they wear around their neck and they kiss, and they have the Virgin Mary statues that they go to pray to be healed from. And there's one Virgin Mary statue in New York, there's one in Los Angeles. It's the same woman, right? Mm-hmm. And yes, we're monotheistic, but we also have the Virgin Mary and the angels and the demons and the like.
Oh gosh, get into theology, and
I'm not trying to pursue a theological point. No. I'm just saying, there's clearly some impulse towards physically embodying these things, and to having a multiplicity of these things that even if we've officially got away from,
interesting,
we haven't quite got away from. And maybe that's just a thing our minds do. I'm as hard on the rationalist end as you're going to go, and I still have precious things that are personally precious and meaningful to me as objects,
Yeah, I think so. And in Mesopotamia, everyone had a personal god and goddess. So it got very, very local, where it's almost like a guardian angel sort of idea.
Yeah.
So they would talk about, my personal god and goddess are with me today because I'm having sort of good luck. And if you had bad luck, it would be, where are my personal god and goddess? They've abandoned me. I need to bring them back. And there's some actually very interesting poetry written, Mesopotamian poetry written on this. There's a very famous one that's called Ludlul Beldameki, which means let me praise the Lord of Wisdom. And it's about a man who feels his personal god and goddess have abandoned him. And he describes his long, long string of bad luck that he has as a result of this. And it does seem as though people that was an explanation for them of their own good fortune or otherwise. And people in their households would have little shrines to the family god, who would not be necessarily one of the great state gods, almost certainly wouldn't be one of the great state gods, but would be a god that they felt watched over their particular family. And so, there was a lot of that. This is and as I said, amulets that they would have in times of pregnancy or childbirth, things that they felt connected them to a force that was going to help. Yeah.
Final question, and this is just one for me. I've just finished your book. What else should someone who is not an academic, this is actually a question for me as well as the audience, what else should someone who's not an academic specialist read on anything within this time period that's interesting, but I don't need a degree in Middle Assyrian to get started on?
There's quite a lot of books. I encourage you, if it's someone reading my book, it's really, there's a lot of footnotes. And if you go to the footnotes and you find the source of where I've, credited this material, you'll often find in the bibliography the relevant book, because there's just so many. I hate to sort of, if your interest was in religion, I would send you one way. If you're interested in ancient cuisine, there's others. If you're interested in
what do you have on ancient cuisine?
Oh gosh, there's a wonderful. I have it on my shelves. Hold on. Do I? I can't see it right away. There are a number of studies of ancient food. There's a nice book that was put together by Yale, actually, they had a exhibit called Mesopotamia Speaks. Again, I'm checking.
I've read the online paper that they published from that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is but
there is just one thing about Ancient Mesopotamia Speaks. There is a chapter in there about ancient cuisine, which I think would be a lovely introduction. The whole book actually is very good in terms of little introductions to aspects of Mesopotamian culture. So
Ancient
there's
Mesopotamia Speaks.
Yeah, Ancient Mesopotamia Speaks is a really nice volume. I hesitate to say that because I have an article in it, so I don't want to seem to be promoting. But the other articles in that
You can self-promote.
really nicely done about different aspects of culture. They're all by top scholars in the field, but they're all writing for a museum audience. So, people who would have come to the exhibit who wanted to know more, and they're all really beautifully written. So I would suggest that would be a good place to start.
That'd be fun. And I can always follow up with links in your book. I've actually tried, they've got the recipes on the cuneiform tablets. I've actually tried doing some of those. I've spent some time trying them.
They're fun to try. Some of them are tricky because, of course, they don't give amounts of ingredients.
Or cooking lengths. Yeah. One thing I found is cooking's my hobby. I spent a long time with Persian cuisine, teaching myself that.
Yeah.
And if you approach them through Persian eyes rather than European eyes, they make a lot more sense.
Oh.
So the one everyone tries is called, I'm probably pronouncing it horribly wrong, tu'u, T-U-T-U.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's like a sort of lamb and beetroot stew.
Yep.
And everyone makes it, and they go, this is kind of weird, and it is. But I was looking at it, and I was looking at all the fresh herbs in it, and I sort of went to the Persian side of my cooking knowledge, and I went, this is a ghormeh sabzi. It's the herbs that are the main ingredient, not the meat or the vegetable.
Yeah.
And so I cooked it that way, and then for whatever reason it clicked.
Oh, nice.
So I don't know. I sort of went. I spent a while. I really looked through these recipes and tried to interpret it from a Middle Eastern cooking tradition rather than a Western one. And then they suddenly made a lot more sense, because I think people cook them with their default cooking knowledge, which is sort of European American.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense that it would be, a continuation of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know how interesting that is, but that was a road I went down.
Because I've made that recipe too. I actually quite like it. But I haven't emphasized the herbs as much as you suggest. That'd be interesting to do.
Yeah. If you do it the way you do ghormeh sabzis, you have as much herbs by weight as meat, and then you braise them off first, and that kind of creates your stock.
Wow. Oh, I will try that. That's great. There's also, of course, the recipes for beer.
Yes.
That people have tried to develop out of the hymn that describes the making of beer. And there've been some, and it's really interesting to taste it too, because it doesn't have hops in it.
I haven't tried that yet. I don't quite trust myself to make my own alcohol. But I'm told it's quite light and quite sour, like a German beer or something.
The one I tried was actually surprisingly sweet, but I think there's lots of different interpretations. And then, of course, by the time they got to the first millennium, beer was largely made out of dates. And it was much more like cider, what we would think of as cider, or hard cider, than what we think of as beer. But they used the same term for it. There was barley beer and there was date beer. But
maybe I'm thinking in the English tradition a bit like mead or something like that.
A little bit, yeah. More
like that's mead. Made out of honey. Mead's way too sweet for me.
Yeah.
Anyway, running over time. Let's pause it there. Thank you for nerding out with me and answering my many "this is a thing that Toby wonders about" questions.
No, I love that. They're great questions. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks again for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.